What's going on, Big for Playmakers TV? Hope you guys are doing well. I'm glad that we got the initial video about coming back to the platform out there. And so, look, it's time to get to work. We're going to talk about one of your favorite topics. That's Florida State football recruiting. But before we do that, instead of just watching me talk the whole time, I am going to share a little highlight. Take us back to the glory days of Florida State football under Mike Norvell there. So you can kind of watch some of the highlights there while we get into it. But if you've been scrolling social media lately, you think Florida State recruiting is falling apart. Is it recruiting at an elite level? No. But FSU would miss on a prospect, it's panic. Player picks another school, panic. National recruiting ranking isn't where fans want it to be, panic. But here's the question nobody seems to be asking is, what if Florida State is building the class exactly the way they plan to? They got a new GM, John Garrett's been there before. So let's talk about why the outrage over Florida State's 2027 recruiter class is way overblown. I mean, you have a dead man walking for a head coach. That's not helping anything. They don't seem to be spending like the other schools. And one thing that has become pretty clear since John Garrett returned as Florida State's general manager is, he's not trying to win recruiting rankings in July. It seems, he's trying to build a roster that can win, and that should sound familiar because they did it before back in 2022-23 when FSU went 23-4 over those 2 years. Because back then Florida State kind of used the same blueprint. They signed some really small recruiting classes from the high school ranks. I'm talking like 17 nationally, or not 17 nationally, but 17 commits total. And then they just went, real transfer portal heavy. Now that was before everybody else had kind of caught up to the importance of transfer portal recruiting. But at the same time, that's where FSU got, a Johnny Wilson and a Jared Verse and a Keon Coleman, Jaheim Bell, Michael Pittman, Braden Fisk. Now the crazy part about that now, a lot of those guys, Wilson was, highly ranked out of high school, but he wasn't really productive at Arizona State. Jared Verse was unknown. Keon Coleman was proven. Jaheim Bell was, pretty proven. Pittman was, he was solid. Fisk came from a non-power 4 conference, but they were all impact players that helped transform Florida State into one of the best teams in the country. So now we fast forward, to today, and it seems like Florida State's again prioritizing quality, over quantity, while keeping plenty of scholarships available for another maybe aggressive run in the transfer portal. We'll see. But one thing I want to talk about is the latest recruiting disaster from a couple of nights when Marquise Fennell, I think, was a running back from South Georgia, committed to Stanford. There's one guy, he's on YouTube and he's on X, and he's like, quote, "Florida State losing a South Georgia recruit to Stanford is absolutely pathetic. That is the state of Florida State program under Mike Norvell. Make no mistake." End quote. Now, that's the same guy who said something similar when Cam Brooks, who's also from South Georgia, committed to Cal around the same time last year. Yeah, we got to stop this fake rage baiting stuff, man. It's corny. I mean, Brooks ultimately signed with FSU last year, around signing day. Fennell could do the same. If not, cool. Fennell choosing Stanford. I mean, it's Stanford. It's a great education. There's nothing wrong with going to Stanford. Especially if you don't have a high likelihood of making it to an NFL. Fennell has, he has a lot of good skills, but, he'll have to develop a lot if he's going to play in the NFL. But, was it a loss? Sure. I mean, he's a good player. He's from in your backyard. Did Florida State want to sign him? Of course. But is it a devastating blow to the recruiting class? No, not even close. I mean, the biggest reason it became such a story is because these recruiting subscription sites, they built the expectation that Fennell was going to choose Florida State and not Stanford. That's the real problem. You got all these guys out here making all these predictions about this and that, and they're not really informed, but taking everybody's money. That is where everybody's kind of getting blindsided, so to speak. They hear these guys, oh yeah, we're going to go cover the commitment ceremony. If I wasn't confident in him choosing FSU, I wouldn't go. I guess they didn't know what they thought they knew. But when that prediction, didn't happen, fans reacted to the surprise, not necessarily the player himself. And that's important. Fennell's, like I said, he's talented, but Florida State isn't without options. I pointed out on X the other night, they already have a blue chip running back commit in the class. It's not like they don't already have a talented running back. They signed a talented running back last recruiting cycle. Chroma has 2 more years if he stays. Sam Singleton has 1 more year after this upcoming year. It's not the end of the world that Marquise Fennell went to Stanford. So let's not act like it's something that's just absolutely crazy or anything like that. People look at Florida State's national ranking and immediately assume the class is weak, but recruiting rankings this early they're influenced by volume. When you look at everything else from the other schools, a lot of them have, 15, 18, 20 plus commits. And, obviously that's going to impact the actual rankings. One of the more important things is looking at the per player average for each player in the class. Basically Florida State's taking a smaller class. I don't think they'll take more than 20 players in this high school recruiting cycle. They took a lot last year, but that's before John Garrett got there as the GM. So if you're just looking at the national ranking, just from a team perspective, is misleading. It's not accurate at all. Again, is the recruiting class elite? No, not even close. But it's not in the 50s either when you look at the quality of the player, so to speak. So here's something else to remember too. I mean, it's not 2015 anymore. You have even the best schools are using the transfer portal and not just high school recruiting. And so FSU's in a similar position that they were a few years ago when they couldn't really afford to take a bunch of high school players and put them out there early because physically they were not ready to play or make a difference. That's why they went the transfer portal route, and it was a right path, right choice to do so. And that's what allowed them to close that gap so quickly between the 2021 season, 2022 season, and then obviously they really peaked in 2023. And that's what they're trying to do again, it seems. And that's why they have John Garrett, I guess. So before everybody declares, Florida State's recruiting class a failure, I want you to ask yourself this. Would you rather finish with the number 12 recruiting class? Not that I think they'll finish that high because they're not going to take that many players, but with to be able to obtain transfer portal impact players that can ultimately make a big difference. Would you rather do that or just sign a bunch of high school guys who many aren't going to contribute just to boost that high school ranking? That's a big distinction that you got to think about. So again, do I expect Florida State to compete for a national title in 2026 or 27? No. Will Mike Norvell even be here after this season, or will he make it to the end of this year? Who knows? And that's the thing. Everybody's in an outrage about missing on a guy from Georgia when really, a lot of this stuff won't even matter if Florida State, just fumbles out of the gate. If they, lose to Bama or lose to SMU and then lose to Bama, that they will probably start with 2-2 because they got 2 cupcakes there. Then I think they have Virginia and Louisville or someone like that. So they could be either 2-4. If they go 2-4, it's a wrap. Like it don't even matter what happens right now. If they go 2-4, it's a wrap. Stick a fork in them. So we're just these people are just out here rage baiting for nothing. So let's just make it to the season. If they start out, if they somehow beat SMU and beat Alabama, and then beat Virginia and then beat Louisville, then then you got a different story on your hands, a different narrative, and maybe they could steal a couple guys here and there. But really, it all depends on the season. I mean, it's cool to see all these high school commits seemingly shut down their commitment here over the last few weeks. But at the end of the day, again, if they have a terrible start to the season, none of that's really going to matter. Unfortunately for Florida State, Mark Neville, and us Florida State fans. But what I want to do too is let's look at. I'm gonna pause this video here, and I'm going to let's look at some of these recruiting rankings. So when you look at 247, they have FSU as the number 56 recruiting class nationally. Now, going back to what I was talking about earlier as far as per player ranking. So let's go down. We're way down here at the load more stage, as we used to joke with some of the other programs. Look, even Bama's at number 49 because they only have 13 commits. Excuse me. FSU has 13 commits and they're at number 56. Here, FSU has an 87.77 per player ranking. And you see Michigan State's above them. They have 86.93. TCU, 86.93. Let's fast forward up here. Look, Purdue, 87.06. Let's go up here. Look, Boston College, 85.73. They got 26 commits. Wake Forest, 29 commits, 85.92. Let's go up here. Let's go all the way up here. Look, Rutgers, 86.67. Pittsburgh, 86.42 with 24 commits. Mind you, FSU has 13. Let's go on up here. Arkansas, number 30th nationally, 23 commits, 87.10. That's lower than FSU's per player ranking. Kansas State has 27 commits, 87.15. Minnesota. So we moved into the top 25. Top 25 here, 87.21. That's lower than Florida State's per player ranking with 29 commits compared to 13 for FSU. Now, so you could conceivably say that, everybody else here is pretty much above FSU in a per player ranking. 80. And look, Clemson has an 88.96, and they are number 11, but they have 24 commits. Everybody else has at least an 88, so they're right over FSU there. So you could say FSU has a top 25 top 25 class with 13 commits if you just look at the per player ranking there. Now, if we come up, so 247 has them at number 56. So if we come over here to Rivals has FSU at they have them at 87.98, so in the same ballpark, and they are number 35 on their team rankings. So not 56, not top 10, 35. They have them with 5 blue chip players and 8 3-stars. And we'll go back over here. So let's look at FSU's class. So they just got, Sam Lejeune, good pickup, D-line prospect. Sean Green, good prospect, wide receiver. Jaden Miles, a good prospect. The running back we talked about earlier that FSU already has. Jannard Albright. I think he's a 4-star composite. They have Eric Vaughn here, D-line prospect. Caballero's an edge prospect. Thompson, who I like a lot, he's maybe like 2.5 hours from my house here in North Carolina, over near Charlotte. Speedster, he could do some damage in the slot. Jackson Holly, edge. So obviously FSU has not had a pass rush for the last couple of years, and that has been a huge weakness for the defense overall. Haven't been able to get off the field on third down, haven't been great against the run. And so, they are trying to address, some of the, the issues. So you got a good D-line prospect here. You got a good wide receiver prospect there, a good running back prospect there, a good linebacker prospect. Linebacker's been a weakness as well. D-line, edge. So they're trying to fill needs. Another wide receiver, another edge. Safety is a real important position in Tony White's defense. So they were able to stave off Louisville for Jamari Foreman here. Ohua Bunwa, I really like as a linebacker. Real productive in high school. So again, they're trying to get more athletic at linebacker on defense. Logan Flaherty, he is what he is. He's, nothing special, but at the same time, he could develop into a decent player. He has some tools. He's more athletic than you think. Arwick Johnson, another linebacker. So again, when you look at FSU in the past, few years, linebacker has been just a weakness. Pass rush has been a weakness. When you look at the D-line, they hit on the Twins last year. Well, we'll see. We'll see how good the Twins are without our guy Daryl in the middle there. So we'll see. But they have some solid prospects here. You don't have a ton of top players, but they are filling some needs on the roster. And again, it kind of is the same process that they went through back in 2021, 22, whenever they took smaller classes and then try to save some resources for some transfer portal players who could make an impact. Now, the thing is, we just don't know how this is going to play out because we don't know how the season's going to go. So again, if they go and just bomb the early part of the year, this strategy is probably going to be, well, actually, it probably is not going to be a terrible strategy because then you won't have, 25, 30 high schoolers who can't play. If you sign that many, you probably have a ton to enter the transfer portal or what have you. So then you have to replace them anyway with transfer portal players. So overall, this is probably the smartest approach. Just take, a smaller high school class, fill some needs. Hopefully you hit on a few guys at a few key positions. Again, D-line, pass rush, linebacker, wide receiver, and then go from there. When you look back to last year, Florida State wasn't terrible. I mean, put it this way. If you could have removed Tommy Castellanos from Florida State's, if you could remove Tommy from the quarterback position and replaced him with, Jordan Travis, what do you think the record would have been last year? I mean, they probably don't lose to Virginia, because those turnovers were killer early in that game. Because Jordan Travis rarely turned the ball over. That's one of the greatest qualities he had. Who else? They don't lose to Stanford. I mean, that's 7 wins right there. They don't lose to NC State. I mean, that's 8 wins right there. Who else? Who else did they play last year? I can't even. That schedule's that year's been so far removed. Let me see. 2025. Who did they lose to? Who else? Clemson, they may have been able to win that game. I mean, the offense just couldn't do anything. So I mean, let's say they beat Clemson. It's at Clemson, so it's probably not likely. But Jordan Travis had beaten them before at Clemson. So I mean, look, eight wins minimum with Jordan Travis, at the helm. A 3-star player coming out of high school. And really, that's been the difference for a team like Miami over the past few years. They hit on the most important position on the field, quarterback. The last 2 years. Well, it kind of cost them last year. And the majority of their production has been from the transfer portal players they've gotten, which is something that the subscription websites don't want to highlight, but it's the truth. Yes, Miami has, had way better recruiting, high school recruiting classes than Florida State. But when you really look at it, the majority of their production has been from transfer portal players, even last year. Now, maybe over time they'll hit on some of those high school players. They did hit on, they did have a couple of high school players who contributed last year. But at the same time, again, the majority of the production was from the transfer portal. So yeah. So look, the recruiting for Florida State right now is nothing to really, and really truthfully, I don't think many fans are caring at this point. It's kind of just wait and see mode, see what happens. But you have these subscription guys out here and these other content creators out here just posting, just rage baiting people, being negative for no reason. I mean, it's why would your expectations be that Florida State would, have a top 10 or top 15 recruiting class this year? Like that makes no sense. Yeah, I know the standard is the standard, but I mean, you got a dead man walking for a coach and they're not willing to spend the money. So why would your expectation be that they're going to have a great recruiting class? You're pretty much just waiting for the season to play out and to see what the next move will be for Florida State. So I think that's the best way to look at it moving forward. I expect Florida State to probably add a couple more talented players. We'll see what happens with Tayshaun Poole. You have the other, what's my guy's name? The Yarborough kid, the offensive lineman. And that's another thing. So the same approach that Miami is taking with quarterback that seems to be what Florida State's doing with the offensive line, because I mean, basically last year they used the portal for almost the entire offensive line, and they kind of took the same approach this year. And they're only really targeting a handful of high school offensive linemen. Now, you could argue and say, is that the right approach? Who knows? But they've last year proved that with the new offensive line coach there, that he kind of knew what he was doing, and they had a real solid product that along the offensive line. Now we'll see if he can replicate that again this year. Hey, that may be the way to go for Florida State, and you can kind of spend those resources elsewhere. But the key for this year will be, I think it'll be similar to last year. You have some skilled players returning who can help change the scoreboard for you, and really it's going to come down to O-line play and quarterback play. Those are going to be the two main factors. If Ashton Daniels can avoid the turnovers, I think FSU will probably surprise some people, because FSU didn't have any problems moving the ball between the 20s last year. It was when they got in the red zone, they turned the ball over, or Castellanos couldn't complete a pass over the middle, or Deuce would bobble ball in the red zone, or whatever could go wrong did go wrong for FSU last year. It seemed when they got in the red zone. But if Ashton Daniels can be serviceable, Florida State probably will surprise people and win a couple more games than people expect. Again, is that the standard? No. Would that be enough to keep Norvell? Possibly. Is that a good thing? Yeah. Man, I don't know. I don't know. I mean, I thought he should have been fired after Stanford last year. You know, I openly posted that all over social media, wrote about it. It didn't happen. And as I mentioned in the other video, you know, I've spent the last year as an athletic director, so I do have a little more understanding of things behind the scenes as to maybe why that Michael Alford didn't pull the trigger on you know getting rid of Mike Norvell after after that debacle at Stanford or any of the other losses for that matter. But I think it's important to see how it plays out this year, and this year will probably tell you all you need to know about Florida State for the foreseeable future. They need to have a good year this year because it's everybody wants to leave the ACC, which I agree we should have been gone. Well, we couldn't leave until we won the lawsuit and all that good stuff, or settled the lawsuit, I should say. But a settle the way we did was a win because you know what the cost is now. You kind of have a timeline of when it's possible to leave and to try to find a suitable landing spot. But Florida State needs a good year this year, or at least like 8 wins to kind of right the ship so that they are still attractive to either the Big Ten or SEC. And because those two conferences are coming up for new TV contracts. And so, you can't be, you can't have another year of lackluster product out there hurting the brand and making you unattractive to those two opportunities that could present themselves. So we'll see how it plays out. But I just wanted to talk about, just don't let these other content creators and subscription sites just, beat you over the head with a bunch of negativity. It is what it is at this point. So we'll see how it plays out, and FSU may get a couple more commits here over the next few weeks, and they'll probably move up to, I guess, the 40s or something like that nationally. But at the end of the day, it's all about how they do this season. And but let me know what you think about this video. What do you think about? Do you think I'm right as far as John Garrett's approach to taking a smaller class and then potentially taking transfer portal players or impact transfer portal players? Now we could argue and say that we don't have a ton of star players, I guess you could say, as far as the transfer portal, but we do have some production and experience. So we'll see how that plays out this year. But let me know in the comments, and we'll see you guys in the next video real soon. Appreciate you guys for tuning in.